For 2 years, Alexander Kensington did not move. He did not speak a single word. This was the man who once made the entire east coast of America tremble with nothing more than a slight furrow of his brow. The man who controlled a shadow empire worth billions of dollars. The man whose enemies would not even dare to say his name out loud in the dark. Now he lay there like a wax figure, breathing through a machine, fed through tubes, existing only as blinking numbers on a monitor. 3 bullets, 1 to the head, 2 to the chest. And the one who pulled the trigger was the very person he called his little brother. The best doctors money could buy had shaken their heads from the very first month. If he wakes up, that is a miracle. And miracles do not exist in medicine. His younger brother, Raymond, took over everything with a smile that never reached his eyes. His sister, Isabella, cried until she had nothing left, and then she, too, had to learn how to keep living. The men who once knelt at his feet now knelt at someone else's. The empire kept running. Money kept flowing. Blood kept spilling. The underworld kept turning without Alexander Kensington. 730 days, 17,520 hours. More than 1 million minutes of silence. Everyone believed he was already dead. Only his heart still beat. But when Grace Sullivan stepped into that dark room on the first night of her shift, she noticed what no one had bothered to see for 2 long years. Not the doctors, not the nurses, not the family, not any of the dozens of people who came in and out of that room every day. Only her, an orphaned girl from Philadelphia with a past carved full of scars and a heart that refused to quit, saw the thing the whole world had stopped searching for. That night, Grace did something so bold it could have gotten her killed on the spot. In the world of men like Kensington, curiosity is a death sentence. Asking the wrong question can make a person disappear without a trace. And Grace, a small nurse who knew nothing about the rules of the dark, did not only ask the wrong question, she wagered everything on a man everyone insisted no longer truly existed. But instead, what happened at 3:17 in the morning sent a shock through the most powerful underworld empire in America. It exposed the traitor. It woke a king from the dead. And it proved that sometimes what pulls a man out of the darkness is not power, not money, not fear, but the hand of someone who refuses to let him vanish, the voice of someone who refuses to stay silent, the heart of someone who believes that no hope has never meant the end. Before we continue, please press like, share this video with someone who needs to hear today's story, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the stories that touch the heart each week. But to understand why Grace Sullivan became the only person who could see what the whole world had missed, we need to turn back time, back to the scarred girl she was before she ever stepped into that dark room. Grace Sullivan was not born into silk and comfort. She was born in a slum apartment on the outskirts of Philadelphia, where the stink of opioids clung to the air and mixed with cheap liquor, where the crying of children was swallowed up by the shouting of adults. Her mother was a drug addict, the kind of woman who loved the high more than she loved the child she brought into the world. Grace never knew who her father was. Maybe her mother didn't know either. When Grace was 5 years old, her mother walked out one night and never came back. She left the child alone in an empty room with 1 box of expired cereal and a scrap of paper with 3 words scrawled across it. "Mother is sorry." 3 days later, a neighbor found Grace curled up in the corner, eyes dried out because she had cried every last tear, lips cracked from thirst. The little girl was taken to Street Margaret Orphanage, a place people called a home, but in truth it was colder than any street. There, Grace learned the first lesson of her life. No one was going to save her except herself. The years in that orphanage were a hell Grace never told anyone about. The director, a middle-aged man with a pleasant smile in front of donors, wore a different face once the doors were closed. Grace was one of the children he chose. From the age of 8 to the age of 14, she lived in constant fear, in forced silence, in long nights when she wished she could simply disappear. But Grace did not disappear. She endured. She clenched her teeth, bit her lip until it bled, and endured. At 16, Grace ran away from the orphanage. She lived on the streets of Philadelphia for 2 years, sleeping in dark corners, eating whatever she could find, doing every legal job a child without papers could do. She washed dishes in restaurants, handed out flyers on the sidewalk, cleaned offices at night, and she studied. Every night under streetlights, Grace read old books she pulled from trash bins, teaching herself what school had never given her. At 20, she passed the high school equivalency exam. At 23, she graduated from nursing school with the highest score in her class, not because she was smarter than everyone else, but because she had walked through hell and was still standing, so nothing could knock her down anymore. Or at least, she thought so. Grace chose emergency nursing because she wanted to save people. She wanted to become the person she had wished for when she was little, the one who showed up in time, the one who did not leave. 7 years in the Philadelphia emergency department showed her everything. Bullets through skulls, horrific car wrecks, bodies crushed by street violence. She had become tough. She thought there was nothing left that could hurt. Until that night. An ordinary Tuesday night. A 6-year-old girl was brought in after a car crash, a drunk driver, the child in the back seat. When Grace saw the girl's golden hair, the blue eyes already starting to dim, it felt as if someone had wrapped a fist around her heart and squeezed. That little girl looked exactly like what Grace imagined herself to be at 5. An abandoned child, a child no one saved. Grace fought. She did CPR. She pushed adrenaline. She shouted for the doctor. The girl's heart stopped 3 times. The first 2 times, they pulled her back. The 3rd time, they couldn't. Grace stood there with blood still on her hands, watching the white sheet cover that small body. She did not cry. She couldn't cry. She only stood there, hollow, as if someone had drained her soul out of her all at once. That night, Grace sat in her car in the hospital parking lot until the sun came up. Her hands would not stop shaking. She could not drive home. She could do nothing except sit there and stare into the empty air. The following week, she filed for a transfer. No more emergency work. No more blood. No more screaming. No more children dying in her hands. She needed quiet. She needed to heal. The offer from the Kensington estate arrived like a strange coincidence. Private long-term intensive care, pay 5 times higher than normal. A stable coma patient, nothing complicated. Just monitor, document, and make sure the machines kept running. Grace didn't ask much. She didn't know who Kensington was. She didn't know about the underworld empire, the bullets, the betraying younger brother. To her, it was just a job, a place to hide from the ghost of the blonde-haired little girl. But fate never lets anyone run forever. Because sometimes, the scars on our own bodies are exactly what allow us to see the wounds in someone else. And Grace Sullivan, the girl who had already walked through hell, was about to step into a completely different kind of hell, where she would face not only death, but people willing to kill to keep a secret. But before Grace Sullivan ever set foot on the Kensington estate, before she saw the man lying motionless in that dark room, we need to know who Alexander Kensington was. Not a body breathing by machine, but the king who once sat on the throne of the dark. Alexander Kensington wasn't born to become a ruler of the underworld. He was born a prince. His father, William Kensington, built the empire from nothing. From the days he was a street kid in Brooklyn until he became the name that made the entire east coast of America bow its head. Alexander was the eldest son, the heir chosen from the moment he drew his first breath. But the crown wasn't what he wanted. He wanted an ordinary life. He wanted to go to college. He wanted to become an architect. But fate doesn't allow the children of darkness to live in the light. When Alexander was 12 years old, his father's enemies came to their home. They couldn't find William, so they took what was most precious to him, his wife. Alexander's mother was shot right in front of him, in the living room of the very house they lived in. She fell onto the oak floor, blood spreading like a red flower in bloom, and her eyes, those eyes stayed on Alexander until the very last second. The 12-year-old child stood there, not screaming, not crying. He only stood there and looked. From that day on, Alexander Kensington never cried again. He froze. Every feeling, every softness, everything that made a human being easy to wound, he locked it away in the deepest room of his soul and threw the key away. He became what the underworld needed, an emotionless machine, a cold genius mind, a leader no one dared to challenge. At 28, when his father was assassinated by the very people who had killed his mother, Alexander took over the empire. And he didn't just take it over. He turned it into something the American underworld had never seen before. Under Alexander's hand, the Kensington Empire doubled in size within 5 years. He controlled seaports, warehouses, shipping, construction, and a financial network so complex that the FBI chased it for an entire decade and still couldn't find a single piece of proof. But what made Alexander different wasn't strength or money. It was principle. Principles so unbreakable that anyone who worked for him had to know them by heart. No drug dealing. Never. Not under any circumstances. Alexander had witnessed how drugs destroyed Grace Sullivan's mother. And even though he didn't know that, he had witnessed similar things hundreds of times. He hated it. He refused to touch it. Anyone in the organization connected to drugs would vanish without a trace. No harm to women and children. This was the red line. Alexander could order a man killed without blinking, but he would never allow anyone to lay a hand on the innocent. Every year, a portion of the empire's profits was anonymously transferred to orphanages and programs that protect abused women. No one knew where the money came from. No one needed to know. No betrayal of the loyal. In Alexander's world, loyalty was gold. He remembered the name of every person who worked for him. He remembered the names of their wives and children. He remembered their birthdays. He paid generous wages, covered medical costs, made sure their children received a proper education. In return, he demanded only one thing: absolute loyalty. On the surface, Alexander Kensington was ice, cold, emotionless, with a gaze that could freeze anyone who dared to look straight at him. But there was one person who saw the real man behind that ice: Isabella, his sister. With Isabella, Alexander was someone entirely different. He would sit for hours listening to her talk about the books she read. He would laugh, a real laugh, when she joked. He would sing the song their mother used to sing to her whenever she had nightmares. Isabella was the only light in Alexander's dark world. She was the reason there was still something human left inside him. And Raymond, his younger brother, always lived in his shadow. Raymond was intelligent too, ruthless too, capable enough to run the empire. But he wasn't the firstborn. He wasn't chosen. And for all those years, that jealousy smoldered like embers beneath cold ash. The night of the 15th of September, 2022, the meeting took place in an old warehouse at the port of Newark, where Alexander often met with important allies. It was a routine meeting, nothing unusual. Raymond stood at his right side as always. Carter, his most loyal bodyguard, stood watch outside the door. No one could have guessed what was about to happen. When the meeting ended, when the allies left, Raymond stepped up behind Alexander. "Brother, I have something I want to say." Alexander turned around, and he saw the gun in Raymond's hand. He saw the eyes of the little brother he had held in his arms from the day that child was born. Those eyes were cold as ice, colder than Alexander himself. Raymond said something. Alexander didn't hear it clearly, or maybe he didn't want to hear it. The first shot tore through the left side of his chest, a few centimeters from the heart. The second hit the right side of his chest, puncturing the lung. The third, to the head, but the bullet went off course, only grazing his temple instead of drilling straight into his brain. Alexander fell. His blood spread across the cold concrete floor, a deep red like his mother's blood 24 years earlier. He lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the rusted warehouse ceiling, and his last thought before the darkness swallowed him wasn't betrayal, wasn't pain. It was Isabella. What would become of his sister when he was gone? Carter found him 15 minutes later, after Raymond had left, after the blood had soaked into the concrete. He screamed for an ambulance. He pressed on Alexander's chest to keep the heart beating. He did everything a bodyguard could do. And by some miracle, Alexander Kensington didn't die. His heart kept beating. His lungs kept breathing. His brain kept working at the bare minimum. But Alexander, the real Alexander, disappeared into the dark, and he didn't come back for 2 years, until Grace Sullivan walked into room 317. The bus dropped Grace Sullivan at the final stop on the road leading out to the outskirts of New York on an October afternoon. She stood there with an old suitcase holding everything she owned, looking up at the enormous iron gate ahead of her. And for the first time in her life, she felt that small. The Kensington estate looked like nothing Grace had ever seen, not even in the movies. The gate stood more than 3 meters tall, glossy black as if carved out of darkness itself, with intricate patterns curling into the shape of the letter K at the center. Behind it stretched a long stone-paved drive, flanked by a row of ancient oak trees, 100 years old, standing like silent guards. And at the end of that road, the mansion rose into view like a castle from a fairy tale, but the kind of fairy tale children should not read before bed. Grace drew a deep breath and stepped through the gate as it was opened by a man in a black suit, his face expressionless as stone. She walked along the stone path, hearing the click of her heels echo in a stillness that felt unnaturally complete. No birdsong, no rustle of wind, only a heavy silence pressing down like an invisible blanket. The front doors opened before Grace could knock. A middle-aged woman with her hair pinned up high and a gray uniform stood waiting. She introduced herself as Maggie Chen, the head nurse, and led Grace inside with brisk, decisive steps. Inside was even more overwhelming than the outside. The ceilings soared high overhead, with crystal chandeliers glittering like 1,000 stars. A marble staircase curved around the main hall. Oil paintings hung along the walls, each one likely worth more than everything Grace would earn in her lifetime. She felt like an ant that had wandered into a palace, small, lost, and entirely out of place. Maggie Chen did not talk much. She simply guided Grace down one corridor after another, giving brief explanations about the schedule, the rules, and what Grace needed to do. Monitor the machines, record the readings, make sure the patient was cared for properly. Do not ask unnecessary questions. Do not speak to strangers. Do not leave the assigned area. Grace nodded at each instruction, but inside her a thread of unease began to creep in. This did not feel like a home. It felt like a prison dressed up to look beautiful. They were walking down the hallway toward the east wing when a man stepped out from a door ahead. Grace stopped as if she had collided with an invisible wall. The man in front of her was about 1.80 meters tall, wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit, black hair slicked neatly back. He was handsome in a cold, sharp way, like a knife honed to a gleaming edge. But what froze Grace in place was not his looks, it was his eyes. Those eyes looked at her as if she were an insect, not worth the trouble, yet easily crushed at any moment if he chose. "This is the new nurse," Maggie Chen said, and her voice suddenly turned more respectful. "Grace Sullivan. This is Mr. Raymond Kensington. Raymond." The name slid through Grace's mind like a cold draft. She didn't know who he was, didn't know about the shooting, the betrayal, the 3 bullets on a September night, but the survival instinct sharpened by her years on the streets of Philadelphia was screaming inside her head. Danger. This man is dangerous. Raymond Kensington looked Grace up and down, his gaze appraising, as if he were pricing an object. Then he spoke, his voice soft as silk, but sharp as a razor. "So you are the one who will take care of my brother." He paused, the corner of his mouth lifting into a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Understand one thing, Sullivan. You are paid to monitor machines, not to think. Do your job, nothing more, and stay out of things that don't concern you. My brother is only a patient who will never wake up. Don't waste time on things that don't matter." Grace wanted to say something, wanted to ask why he spoke about his own brother as if he were an old piece of furniture, but she swallowed the words. Her instincts told her to stay quiet, and Grace had learned long ago that instinct was rarely wrong. Raymond left without another word, leaving Grace standing there with the feeling she had just been plunged into ice water. Maggie Chen led her onward without commenting on what had just happened, but Grace noticed she walked faster now, as if she wanted to escape the pocket of air Raymond had left behind. Room 317 was at the very end of the East Wing hallway, separated from the rest of the mansion like a world of its own. Maggie Chen stopped in front of a thick oak door and handed Grace a key card and a ring of keys. "Your shift starts at 10 at night and ends at 6 in the morning. Everything you need is in the room. If there is any problem, press the emergency call button." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Grace alone in front of the sealed door. Grace stood there a long moment, her hand tight around the key card. She didn't know why her heart was beating so fast. She didn't know why her breathing had become shallow. She only knew that once this door opened, her life would change. And she was right. Room 317 lay in darkness when Grace stepped inside for the first time that night. The heavy curtains were drawn shut, leaving only a narrow slit where moonlight slipped through, painting a thin, fragile line across the wooden floor. The ventilator made its steady hum. The heart monitor blinked green numbers in the dark. And on the bed in the center of the room, a man lay motionless. Grace moved closer, her heart hammering in her chest. The moonlight fell across the man's face as if fate had arranged it, illuminating features that were sharp and strong, yet strangely gentle in that endless sleep. Alexander Kensington. She whispered the name she had just learned. The King of the Dark, the man who had not moved in 2 years. She stood there, looking down at him, waiting for the familiar feeling. The emptiness she usually felt when she looked at long-term coma patients. The sense of absence, of a body without a soul. But it didn't come. Instead, Grace felt something else, something she couldn't name. A faint presence, as if someone were watching her from very far away, from somewhere so deep that light could not reach. She leaned in, studied Alexander's face more closely, and in that instant she could swear she saw his eyelid flicker, just slightly, so small that anyone else would have missed it. But Grace was not just anyone else. Grace was the girl who had survived the first 16 years of her life by noticing the smallest details. And she knew, with a certainty she could not explain, that this man was not empty. He was still here. Grace whispered, her voice trembling in the darkness. "I don't know why, but I know you're still here." And from that moment on, everything began to change. The first night in room 317 stretched out like a century. Grace sat in the chair beside the hospital bed, her back straight, her eyes never leaving the face of the man lying in front of her. She had checked every machine, recorded every number exactly the way the protocol required, done everything an intensive care nurse was supposed to do. But after the work was finished, she didn't leave. She stayed there, in the darkness broken only by the blinking light of the heart monitor screen, and she watched Alexander Kensington. 2 years, she whispered into the empty air. "You've been lying here for 2 years." No one answered. Only the steady sound of the ventilator, like the beat of an artificial heart. Grace knew she shouldn't be doing this. Maggie Chen had been clear. Do your job, nothing more and nothing less. Raymond Kensington had warned her, don't waste time on things that don't matter. But Grace couldn't sit still. There was something in this room, a presence she could feel the way she could feel the temperature in the air, pulling her closer to the man in the bed. She stood up, stepped to the bedside, and did something that perhaps no one had done in the past 2 years. She took his hand. Alexander's hand was much larger than hers, long fingers with knuckles clearly defined beneath the skin. But what surprised Grace wasn't the size of that hand. It was the warmth. This hand was warm, not the warmth of room temperature, not the warmth of blankets, the warmth of life, the warmth of blood moving through veins, the warmth of a heart still beating for some reason medicine could not explain. Grace tightened her hold just a little, as if trying to send a message through skin and bone. Then she began to speak. "My name is Grace Sullivan." Her voice was small, almost a whisper, but in the quiet space of the room, each word landed clearly. "I'm your new nurse. I'm from Philadelphia. I don't know who you are. I don't know what you've done. I don't know why you're here. But I know one thing." She paused, her eyes dropping to Alexander's face in the faint moonlight. That face did not react. Not a movement. Not a sign. But Grace kept talking, because she felt like she had to. "I've met a lot of coma patients," she said, and her voice began to sound more natural, as if she were speaking to an old friend. "I know what it feels like to look at a body and see nothing inside. Empty, like a house with no one living in it. But you're different." She leaned closer, her voice turning softer. "I don't know why, but I feel like you're still here. Somewhere inside, you can hear me. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm imagining it. But I've lived my whole life by trusting my instincts. And my instincts are telling me you haven't gone anywhere." She fell silent for a moment, listening to her own breathing blend with the steady hum of the ventilator. Then she spoke again, and there was a promise in her voice, a promise she didn't even know she could keep. "I don't know what happened to you. I don't know who did this to you. But I want you to know one thing." She squeezed Alexander's hand tighter, as if pouring all her strength into that small point of contact. "I won't abandon you. No matter what happens, I won't abandon you." And then it happened. Alexander's finger moved. Just a little. So small that if Grace hadn't been holding his hand, she never would have noticed. But she was holding his hand, and she felt it clearly. The slight curl of his fingers, the faint pressure against her palm. Grace's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the hand she was holding, not daring to breathe, not daring to move. It could have been a muscle reflex. It could have been coincidence. But deep inside, Grace knew it wasn't reflex. She knew, with a certainty science couldn't explain, that Alexander Kensington had just answered her. He could hear her, he was still here, and he didn't want to be abandoned. Grace pulled her phone from her pocket with her free hand, the other hand never letting go of Alexander's. She opened the Notes app and began to type, her finger trembling on the touchscreen. "Night 1, 2:17 in the morning. Patient Alexander Kensington. When I said, 'I won't abandon you,' the patient's right fingers showed slight movement, estimated to last about 2 seconds. Could be reflex. Further observation needed." She saved the note, then looked down at Alexander's face again. He was still motionless, still silent, still sunk in a sleep with no end in sight. But Grace no longer saw a body. She saw a man imprisoned inside his own flesh, waiting for someone to find the door that would set him free. And that night, sitting in the darkness of room 317 with Alexander's warm hand in her own, Grace Sullivan made a decision. She would find that door. No matter how long it took, no matter what she had to face, she would not let this man disappear into the dark. The first week passed like a strange dream Grace didn't want to wake up from. Every night, when the clock hands pointed to 10 and the door to room 317 closed behind her, She stepped into a private world no one else was allowed to touch. She checked the machines, recorded the readings, did everything by the book so no one could fault her. But after she finished the duties of a nurse, Grace became something else. She became the only voice in Alexander Kensington's desert of silence. On the second night, she told him about the weather outside. It was turning cold. Autumn had arrived. The trees on the estate were changing color, golden as honey. She described every smallest detail, from the way the late afternoon sun poured through the canopy, to the dry leaves whispering underfoot when she walked in from the gate. She spoke as if Alexander could see through her eyes, as if she were painting with words for a man who had seen nothing for 2 years. On the third night, she asked about his family. She didn't know much, only what Maggie Chen had mentioned by accident. "You have a younger brother named Raymond, right?" she asked, watching every line of Alexander's face. No reaction. She continued, "And you have a sister too, Isabella, right?" The heart monitor blinked. 72, 73, 75. Grace stared at the number climbing, her own heart racing with it. 77, 78, then it slowly drifted back down to normal. She pulled out her phone and wrote it down immediately. Night 3, 1:23 in the morning. When I mentioned the name Isabella, the patient's heart rate increased from 72 to 78, lasting about 15 seconds before returning to normal. The response appears related to emotion rather than a purely physiological reflex. The fourth night brought a storm. Rain poured down on the estate as if the sky itself were crying. Wind shrieked through the window seams, and thunder and lightning tore the night into pieces. Grace sat beside Alexander's bed, holding his hand the way she had begun to do without thinking, when an especially loud crack of thunder rolled through and made the whole room tremble. And she saw it. Alexander's eyebrows drew together, just a little, those 2 faint arcs moving closer as if he were displeased, as if he were reacting to the violence of the sound outside. The movement lasted no more than 3 seconds, then vanished, his face settling back into its calmness. But Grace had seen it. She had seen it clearly. Night 4, 2:45 in the morning. When there was a loud clap of thunder, the patient's eyebrows furrowed for approximately 3 seconds. This is a response to external auditory stimulation. The patient may be able to hear and react to the surrounding environment. On the 5th and 6th nights, Grace began to test more systematically. She spoke in different tones, watching for reactions. She read the news, read books, even sang songs she remembered from childhood. She wrote down everything. When the heart rate changed, when the breathing deepened, the smallest movements of a finger or an eyelid. Each night, the notes on her phone grew by several pages. The 7th night was the night that changed everything. Grace had found an old recording in Alexander's medical file, a voicemail message from Isabella to him before the incident happened. She didn't know what it said. She didn't know whether she should play it, but she decided to try. "Brother, it's Isabella." The clear voice of a young woman filled the silent room. "I miss you. I know you're busy, but call me back when you have time, okay? Oh, I just finished the book you recommended. It was so good. I want to tell you about it. Love you." The recording ended, and Grace saw something she would never forget for the rest of her life. A tear, just one, sliding from the corner of Alexander's tightly closed eye, moving slowly down his temple, then soaking into the white pillow. She sat there, still holding his hand, and she cried, not from sadness, but because she knew she had been right. Alexander Kensington was not a body. He was a man imprisoned, hearing, feeling, crying because he missed his sister. He was still here, and he was waiting for someone to pull him out of the dark. Night 7, 3:10 in the morning. When he heard his sister Isabella's voice through the recording, the patient cried, one tear from the left eye. "This is not a reflex. This is emotion. The patient is conscious, I am sure." Grace saved the note, then looked down at Alexander's face. She gently wiped the remaining trace of tears on his cheek with her fingertip. "I see you now," she whispered, "and I won't let you disappear." Grace brought everything she had to see Dr. Whitfield on the morning of the 8th day. Her phone was filled with detailed notes from every night, every hour, every smallest reaction she had observed. She hadn't slept at all the night before, sitting there and organizing everything into a clear, logical report, with specific dates and times and precise descriptions. She believed that anyone who looked at this evidence would have to admit it. Alexander Kensington was not a body. He was still conscious. Dr. Thomas Whitfield was the Kensington family's private physician, a man with hair as white as silver, tired eyes, and deep wrinkles carved across his forehead, as if he had seen too much in his life. He received Grace in a small office in the west wing of the mansion, his gaze moving over the notes. She presented with the patience of a man who had heard the same kind of story hundreds of times before. His heart rate rises when he hears his sister's name, Grace said, her voice bright and eager like a child trying to convince an adult to believe in a miracle. His eyebrows furrow when there's thunder, and he cried. He truly cried when he heard Isabella's voice. This isn't reflex, Dr. Whitfield. This is emotion. He can hear. He can feel. Doctor. Whitfield set Grace's phone down on the desk, took off his glasses, and rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. He sighed, a heavy sigh that carried the scent of cold coffee and weary discouragement. Miss Sullivan, he began, his tone gentle but weighted like a verdict. I understand you want to help. I appreciate your dedication. But what you're describing is muscle reflex, brainstem activity, things that are entirely normal in coma patients. A heart rate can change for a million reasons. A brow movement is a reflex to a loud sound. And as for tears, he paused, as if choosing words that wouldn't be too cruel. That is the tear gland functioning. There is no consciousness behind any of it. Grace felt as if someone had punched her in the chest. But I saw it, she said, her voice shaking. I felt it. He squeezed my hand. He reacts when I speak to him. You want to believe that, doctor, Whitfield said, putting his glasses back on and looking straight into her eyes. But wanting to believe doesn't make it true. I have followed Alexander Kensington for 2 years. I have run every test possible. His brain is no longer functioning at a conscious level. He doesn't hear. He doesn't feel. He only exists, and that is all we can do. Maintain that existence. Grace left Dr. Whitfield's office with steps as heavy as stone. She didn't cry. She had forgotten how to cry a long time ago, but she felt a cold emptiness spreading through her chest. That familiar feeling of not being believed, of being brushed aside as if she wasn't worth listening to. That afternoon, Maggie Chen called her into the nurse's office for a private talk. The middle-aged woman stood there with a stern face, her lips pressed into a hard line. I heard you met with Dr. Whitfield, Maggie said, her voice carrying no friendliness at all. Miss Sullivan, I'll be direct. You're crossing the line. Your job is to care for the patient, not to make medical diagnoses. You're not a doctor. You have no right to conclude whether the patient is conscious or not. I only want to help, Grace answered, her voice weak as a candle in the wind. Then help by doing your job properly. Maggie cut in, her eyes cold as ice. And don't bother the Kensington family with false hope. Mr. Raymond has heard about this. He's not happy. Do you understand what I mean? Grace understood. She understood better than anyone. From that day on, everything changed. The other nurses on the estate began to avoid Grace as if she were a disease. They didn't talk to her during breaks. They stopped mid-conversation when she walked into the room. She heard whispers behind her back, words like crazy, delusional, not normal, slipping into her ears like small needles. At lunch, Grace sat alone in the corner of the dining room, watching her coworkers laugh and talk at the table on the other side. No one invited her. No one looked at her. She became a ghost in the very place she worked, an existence everyone wanted to ignore. But Grace was used to being isolated. She had lived her entire childhood as an invisible child in an orphanage. She had lived 2 years on the streets while no one bothered to look at her. Loneliness couldn't kill her. It only made her stronger. And every night, when the door of room 317 closed, Grace still sat there, holding Alexander's hand and talking to him as if the whole world didn't exist. They might not believe her, but she believed herself, and she would not give up. On the 11th night, Grace left room 317 earlier than usual to get more gauze from the medical room downstairs. The mansion corridor at 3 a.m. was empty as a graveyard, with only the pale yellow glow of wall lamps casting long shadows across the polished stone floor. Grace walked softly, a habit from the years when she had learned to move without a sound in the orphanage so she wouldn't be discovered. She was passing Raymond's office when she heard a voice. The thick oak door wasn't fully shut, leaving a thin slice of light and a spill of sound escaping into the hall. Grace knew she shouldn't stop. She knew the rules here. Don't ask unnecessary questions. Don't listen to what you're not supposed to hear. But when she heard the name Alexander, her feet froze in place on their own. I can't wait anymore. Raymond's voice cut through, cold and sharp. It's been 2 years. 2 years of him lying there like a corpse. The Empire needs a real leader, not a ghost who will never wake up. Grace held her breath, pressing herself against the wall beside the door, her heart pounding hard in her chest. Another voice came through the phone, muffled and unclear, but it sounded like it was pushing back. Raymond cut it off with a note of irritation. I know what the law says. But this is my family. This is a family decision. And I'm the one who makes that decision. A brief silence. Then Raymond continued, his voice dropping lower but still clear enough that Grace caught every word. Doctor, Whitfield will sign the papers. He doesn't have a choice. I've already spoken to him. The diagnosis is irreversible coma. No sign of improvement after 2 years. Medically, withdrawing life support is a reasonable decision. 2 more weeks. We'll finish all the procedures in 2 weeks. Grace felt as if someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over her head. Withdraw life support. 2 weeks. They were going to kill Alexander in 2 weeks. No, not they. Raymond. Raymond was going to kill his own brother. For the second time. The voice on the phone spoke again, this time seeming to ask about Isabella. Raymond let out a dry laugh, a sound with no warmth in it at all. My sister. She'll cry for a week and then she'll get over it. She's young. She'll move on. And she has no say in this. I'm the legal heir when Alexander is no longer capable of leading. I make the decision. End of story. Grace heard footsteps moving inside the room, and her survival instincts flared instantly. She backed away, then moved fast down the corridor with her heart galloping, not daring to turn her head. She didn't get the gauze anymore. She went straight back to room 317, shut the door, and leaned her back against the wall, gasping as if she had run a marathon. Now she understood everything. Why Raymond looked at his brother like an obstacle. Why he wanted her not to waste time. Why Dr. Whitfield dismissed every piece of evidence she brought. Why everyone insisted Alexander had no hope, because Raymond wanted him dead. And Raymond had enough power to make it happen. Grace looked toward the bed where Alexander lay motionless beneath the blinking light of the heart monitor. 2 weeks. She had only 2 weeks. She went to the bedside, took Alexander's warm hand, and squeezed it tight. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but every word carried a resolve hard as steel. I heard it, she whispered. Your brother wants to kill you. This time he won't use a gun. He'll use paperwork and a doctor's signature. But the result will be the same. You'll die. She stopped, drawing a deep breath to steady herself. Unless I prove you're still conscious. Unless I find someone who believes me. Unless I stop him. 2 weeks. I have 2 weeks. Grace didn't know what kind of man she was up against. She didn't know about the underworld empire. The bullets on that September night. The blood spreading across concrete. She knew only one thing. She was standing between a murderer and his victim. And she, an orphan girl from Philadelphia, with a past full of scars, was the only one who could save Alexander Kensington. 2 weeks to do the impossible. The clock had begun to count down. Grace knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed allies. She needed someone with power in this family. She needed someone who would believe that Alexander was still here. And there was only one person like that. Isabella Kensington. In the 2 weeks she had worked at the estate, Grace had only seen Isabella a few times from a distance. A young woman, 28 years old, with long brown hair and eyes as sad as the ocean after a storm. Isabella lived in the west wing of the mansion, rarely appearing, and when she did, she always looked like someone trying to survive one day at a time. Maggie Chen had once mentioned that she still visited her brother every week, even though everyone said it was pointless. That was all Grace needed to know. The next morning, when her shift ended, Grace didn't go back to the staff quarters the way she usually did. She walked toward the west wing, her heart pounding with every step. She had no appointment. She had no right to be here. If Raymond found out, she would be fired immediately, or worse, but she had no other choice. Isabella was sitting in the winter garden when Grace found her, a glass-walled space filled with green plants and blooming flowers in the chill of autumn. The young woman sat on a white iron chair, a book in her hands, but her eyes were fixed on nothing, not truly reading. When Grace stepped in, Isabella lifted her head, surprise mixed with caution on her face. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice gentle but edged with the defensiveness of someone who had grown too used to disappointment. "I'm Grace Sullivan," Grace said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm your brother's night nurse. I need to talk to you about Alexander." Isabella's expression changed immediately when she heard her brother's name. She set the book down, straightened, and looked at Grace with complete focus. "What is it? Is he okay? Is something wrong with the machines?" Grace shook her head. "It's not the machines. It's something else, much more serious. Can you give me 10 minutes? I promise you'll understand after you hear me out. Isabella studied Grace for a long moment, as if trying to read the true intention behind her eyes. Then she nodded and gestured to the chair across from her. Sit. Grace sat down and began to tell her everything. From the first night, she felt Alexander's presence. From the finger movement when she said she would not abandon him. From the heart rate rising when she mentioned Isabella's name. From the eyebrows tightening when thunder shook the night. From the single tear when he heard his sister's voice through the recording. She handed her phone to Isabella and showed her every page of detailed notes, every date, every hour, every smallest response she had observed. And finally, she told her about the conversation she had overheard the night before, about Raymond's plan, about the 2 weeks they had left, about a death being scheduled for Alexander Kensington. When Grace finished, Isabella sat there in silence. Her shoulders began to tremble, and then tears slid down her cheeks. Not the sobbing of someone falling apart, the crying of someone who had held it in too long, of someone who had finally heard what she had always believed but no one would confirm. I knew it, Isabella whispered, her voice thick with tears. I always knew he was still in there. Every time I visited, I could feel it, but everyone kept telling me I was lying to myself. Raymond said I needed to accept reality. Doctor Whitfield said he wasn't conscious anymore. I started to think maybe they were right. Maybe I was crazy. You're not crazy, Grace said, reaching for Isabella's hand. Your brother is still here, I'm sure of it. But we only have 2 weeks to prove it before Raymond moves. Isabella wiped her tears, and when she looked up, her eyes had changed. They were no longer the sad eyes of a young woman trying to survive. They were the eyes of someone getting ready to fight. Raymond doesn't know you heard it, she asked. Grace shook her head. I don't think so. Good. Isabella stood up, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. Listen to me, Grace Sullivan. I don't have any power in my family's empire. Raymond controls everything. But I have my own money. I have connections Raymond doesn't know about. And most importantly, I have a reason to fight. She looked straight into Grace's eyes, her voice firm as steel. 2 weeks. I will help you with everything you need. I will provide anything that might stimulate him. Old objects, recordings, anything at all. You prove he's still conscious. I will handle the rest. We will save my brother. And in the winter garden flooded with morning light, the two women clasped hands, forming an alliance no one inside the Kensington estate knew existed. The flame of hope, small and fragile, began to flicker in the dark. That night, after leaving the Kensington estate, Grace didn't drive straight back to the small rented room she kept on the outskirts of the city. She drove in circles through empty streets with no destination, only trying to let her mind settle into the steady hum of the engine. But the quiet didn't come. Her thoughts kept spinning in her head like a storm that refused to break apart. When she finally reached the apartment, the clock was already creeping close to midnight. The small room greeted her with its familiar, cold silence. A single bed, a small desk, an old wardrobe, a few takeout containers she hadn't thrown away yet. This wasn't home. It was only where she slept between shifts, a temporary stop in a life with no real destination. Grace didn't turn on the lights. She sat down on the floor with her back against the wall, staring toward the window where the streetlights spilled in, casting pale orange bands across the darkness. And in that dark, the ghosts of her past began to come for her. She saw the emergency room again, that night. The harsh white lights, the shriek of machines, the shouts of doctors and nurses. And on the stretcher in the center of the room, a 6-year-old girl with golden hair matted with blood, blue eyes slowly losing their light. Baby. Grace heard her own voice echo in memory. Look at me. Look into my eyes. I won't let you go. But she had let her go. The girl's heart stopped the first time and they brought her back. The second time they brought her back. The third time, Grace stood there with her hands on that small chest, pressing down, pressing down, pressing down, and nothing happened. No heartbeat returned. No miracle came. Only the silence of death spreading outward like oil on water. Grace wrapped her arms around her knees, her body trembling in the dark of the empty room. She didn't cry. She hadn't been able to cry since that night. The tears seemed to have dried up, leaving a barren desert inside her chest. But the pain was still there, sharp as a razor, cutting into her heart every time she closed her eyes. What am I doing? The question rose inside Grace, aching and merciless. Am I trying to save Alexander Kensington, or am I trying to save myself? She thought about the fierce way she had thrown herself into proving Alexander was conscious. She thought about the sleepless nights, recording every smallest reaction. She thought about how she had confronted Dr. Whitfield, Maggie Chen, even Raymond Kensington. Was she doing all of it for Alexander? Or was she trying to find meaning for her own existence again? Trying to scrub away the guilt of not saving the blonde-haired little girl? Trying to prove she wasn't a failure? Was Alexander only a way for her to heal her own wound? Grace closed her eyes and let that question drill deeper into her mind. She didn't run from it. She had learned long ago that running only makes pain stronger. She had to face it. She had to answer honestly. And the answer came, slowly but clearly, like dawn pushing back the dark. Maybe both, Grace whispered into the empty air. Maybe I'm trying to save him and save myself at the same time. And does that matter? She opened her eyes and looked out the window where stars glittered above the city's horizon. Did it matter if her motives weren't perfectly selfless? Did it matter if she needed Alexander to live as much as Alexander needed to be saved? The final result would still be a life saved. The final result would still be a man not killed by his own brother. Her motives might not be perfect, but the act was still right. Grace stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the sleeping city below. She thought about the blonde-haired little girl, about the blue eyes that had closed forever. She couldn't change the past. She couldn't save that child, but she could change the present. She could save Alexander Kensington. I couldn't save you, she said to the ghost in her memory, and her voice carried a sacred promise. But I won't let it happen again. Whether I'm doing this for him or for myself, whatever my reasons are, I won't let anyone be abandoned again. No one. And in the empty room in the middle of the night, Grace Sullivan found her calm again. Not the calm of someone who had healed. The calm of someone who had accepted the wound and chosen to keep walking anyway. 14 days. She had 14 days to do the impossible, and she would not waste a single second. 14 days. The clock started counting down from the moment Grace stepped back into room 317 with an entirely new plan. She had spent the whole night researching on the internet, reading about ways to stimulate coma patients, about miraculous recoveries medicine couldn't explain, about sensory stimulation therapy that some advanced hospitals were testing. She wasn't a doctor. She didn't have specialized credentials. But she had instinct. She had patience, and she had 14 days to create a miracle. On the first day, Grace brought a small speaker and began playing classical music in Alexander's room. Not random music, but Beethoven's symphonies Isabella said he used to love. She sat beside the bed, held his hand, and kept talking in a gentle but clear voice. She described the room, described the weather outside, described what was happening in the world he had been cut off from for 2 years. And she watched. She watched for the smallest movement of an eyelid, a finger, a rise of the chest. The first night brought nothing unusual. Alexander lay motionless as always, with only the steady hum of the ventilator keeping company with the flowing melody. But Grace didn't lose heart. She knew miracles didn't arrive in a single night. On the second day, she changed tactics. Instead of speaking in generalities, she began telling stories about herself, about her childhood in the orphanage, about the years on the streets, about the journey that made her a nurse. She told it in a low voice, sometimes trembling when she touched painful memories. But she never stopped. She wanted Alexander to hear a real human being, not a machine reciting a script. And that night, as she was telling him about the first time she ever saved a patient in the emergency room, she saw Alexander's eyes move beneath his closed lids, not clearly, only a faint flutter, as if someone were trying to see through a curtain of darkness. The third day brought the first breakthrough. Grace was sitting by the bed, reading aloud from a passage in the book Isabella said Alexander loved, when she realized his eyes were moving. Not a random flutter like before, but moving toward the direction of her voice. When she leaned to the left and kept reading, the eyes beneath those closed lids shifted left as well. When she stood up and walked toward the foot of the bed, those eyes followed her. Grace was shaking so hard she had to set the book down. She pulled out her phone and wrote it down immediately, her fingers trembling so badly she had to type it more than once. Day 3, 2:35 in the morning. Patient's eyes move in the direction of the voice. This is a purposeful response. Patient can hear and is attempting to locate the sound source. On the fourth day, Isabella met Grace in secret in the winter garden and handed her a small box. Inside were keepsakes from Alexander's past, a pocket watch that had belonged to his father, a hand-embroidered handkerchief that had belonged to his mother, and most importantly, an old tape recorder containing recordings of his deceased mother's voice. "My mother died when he was 12, Isabella said, her eyes red. He kept these recordings like treasure. Sometimes I would hear him play them alone in his room, before everything happened. If anything can reach him, it's this. On the night of the 4th day, Grace played the first recording. The voice of a gentle woman filled the silent room. She was singing a lullaby, her voice warm as late afternoon sunlight, carrying the boundless love of a mother for her child. And Alexander reacted. His hand tightened around Grace's. Not a slight movement like before. A firm, powerful squeeze, as if he were clinging to something so he wouldn't be swept away. Grace looked down at his hand holding hers, and her tears began to fall. Day 5, day 6, day 7. Grace played the mother's recordings again and again. She placed the pocket watch in his hand, letting him feel its familiar weight. She brought the embroidered handkerchief close to his nose, letting the old scent of cloth and time stir memories that had been sleeping. Each night, Alexander's responses grew clearer. His grip grew tighter. His eyes moved more. Some nights, Grace even saw his lips tremble, as if he were trying to say something but sound couldn't break free. She wrote down everything, every detail, every response, every moment of progress, no matter how small. The notes on her phone grew longer day by day, packed with evidence she hoped would be enough to convince the world. 7 days had passed. 7 days remained. Half the time was gone, and Grace had proven what she had always believed. Alexander Kensington was not a body. He was a man fighting his way back, and she would fight beside him until her last breath. The 8th day marked a turning point Grace wouldn't have dared to dream of. She was sitting beside Alexander's bed as she did every night, her hand wrapped around his, her mouth talking through the latest news of the day, when an idea flashed through her mind. If he could squeeze her hand, that meant he could communicate. Not with words, but with movement. Grace straightened, her heart beating faster at the possibility opening in front of her. She gave Alexander's hand a gentle squeeze and spoke slowly, each word clear, as if teaching a child. Alexander, I'm going to ask you a few questions. If the answer is yes, squeeze my hand once. If the answer is no, squeeze twice. Do you understand? A silence stretched out. Grace held her breath, her eyes locked on the hand resting in hers. Then she felt it. One squeeze. Slow, but unmistakable. One. Yes. Grace had to bite her lip to keep from sobbing right there. You can hear me, she went on, her voice trembling. You understand what I'm saying. One squeeze. Do you know where you are? One squeeze. Do you know how long it's been? A longer silence. Then 2 squeezes. No. Alexander didn't know 2 years had passed. She drew a deep breath, forcing her voice to stay calm even as her heart broke with pity. It's been 2 years, Alexander. You've been lying here for 2 years. The hand in hers clenched with a painful force, as if he'd just been punched in the chest. Grace let him absorb it. She didn't say anything else, only held his hand and waited. That night, they communicated for 2 full hours. Grace asked, and Alexander answered with 1 squeeze or 2. She asked about family, about Isabella, about what he remembered before everything happened. She was careful not to mention Raymond, careful not to mention the shooting. Not yet. He needed to recover first. On the 9th and 10th days, the system grew smoother. Alexander responded faster, squeezed harder, clearer. Grace began to ask more complicated questions, and he could answer most of them. She discovered he preferred classical music to modern music. He missed his sister. He didn't like the sharp smell of hospital disinfectant. He wanted to hear birdsong. Each answer was a small piece in the picture of the real Alexander Kensington, the man behind the underworld empire, the brother behind the cold exterior, the human being trapped inside his own body. On the night of the 11th day, Grace decided to ask the question she had been waiting to ask for days. The room lay in darkness, with only moonlight slipping through a crack in the curtains and the blue blinking light of the heart monitor. Grace held Alexander's hand, feeling the familiar warmth of it, and asked in a whisper, Alexander, I need to ask you an important question. A very important one. She paused, drawing a deep breath to find the courage. Do you want to live? The question rang through the still air like a bell. Grace waited, her heart hammering, not daring to breathe. If he answered no, she didn't know what she would do. If he was exhausted, defeated, ready to let go after 2 years trapped in the dark, she had no right to force him to keep fighting. Alexander's hand clenched. Not the gentle squeeze from before, a hard squeeze. So hard, Grace had to grit her teeth to keep from crying out in pain. A squeeze as if he had poured every last ounce of strength left in his paralyzed body into that single movement. 1 squeeze. Only 1. But but so strong Grace felt her bones might crack. Yes. He wanted to live. He wanted to come back. He was still fighting. Tears slid down Grace's cheeks as she bent forward and rested her forehead against the hand gripping hers. "I won't let you die," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I swear to you, I won't let anyone kill you." The 12th day was the day everything changed completely. Grace was playing the recording of Alexander's mother's voice as usual, the familiar lullaby filling the hushed room, when she saw something that froze her in place. Alexander's lips moved. Not a random tremble, not a reflex spasm, but purposeful movement, as if he were trying to open his mouth, trying to form sound, trying to say something his throat, paralyzed for 2 years, could not release. Grace stopped the recording at once and leaned down close to his face. "What are you trying to say?" she asked, her voice shaking with emotion. "Take your time." "I'm listening." His lips moved again, slowly, with effort. As if every millimeter demanded a massive strain, Grace stared at those dry, cracked lips trying to part, trying to shape a word, a sound, anything to break 2 years of silence. And then she heard it. Not a clear word, only a breath, a faint, indistinct sound slipping from his dry throat, but it was there. The first sound after 730 days, proof that Alexander Kensington wasn't only hearing, feeling, understanding. He was trying to speak. Grace broke down right then, tears falling onto Alexander's face, onto the lips still moving, still struggling. She gripped his hand, lifted it to her mouth and kissed it softly, whispering through her sobs, "You can do it. You're doing it." 2 days left. Only 2 days to prove to the world what Grace had known since the very first night. Alexander Kensington was still here, and he was fighting his way back. On the morning of the 13th day, Grace had just finished her shift and was getting ready to leave room 317 when the door flew open with a violent bang. Raymond Kensington stood there, his face flushed a deep purple with rage, the eyes that were usually ice cold now burning with a furious fire. Behind him was Maggie Chen, her head bowed, not daring to look at Grace. "Miss Sullivan," Raymond strode into the room, his voice shaking with the effort of control. "I made myself clear. Your job is to care for the patient, not to conduct your own insane experiments. But it seems you don't understand." Grace felt the blood in her body turn cold. He knew. He knew what she had been doing. Maybe Maggie Chen had reported her. Maybe the security cameras had captured it. It didn't matter how. What mattered was that he knew. "I'm only trying to help him," Grace said, her voice steadier than she expected. "He's responding. He can communicate. If you give me more time, I can prove it." "Prove what?" Raymond snapped, stepping closer with a threatening edge. "Prove that you're a nurse who doesn't follow protocol. Prove that you're exploiting a helpless patient to feed your own delusions. My brother died 2 years ago. The thing lying in that bed is just a corpse with a beating heart. And you," he jabbed a finger toward Grace's face, "you're fired. Effective immediately. You have 1 hour to pack your things and leave the estate. If you're still here after 1 hour, I will call security to drag you out." "You can't do that," Grace said, but her voice had gone weaker. "I have evidence. He's conscious. I can prove it." Raymond gave a dry laugh, a cold sound with no humor in it at all. "You have 1 hour, Miss Sullivan. Don't make me repeat myself." He turned and walked out, Maggie Chen following like a shadow. The door slammed shut, leaving Grace alone with a broken heart and a clock counting down. 1 hour. She had 1 hour. And only 2 days left before Raymond carried out his plan. Grace looked toward Alexander lying motionless on the bed, his lips still dry and cracked from last night's attempt to speak. She couldn't leave. She couldn't abandon him. But she also couldn't stay after Raymond had ordered her out. She stood there in the middle of the room, not knowing what to do, when the door opened again. This time it was a middle-aged man around 40, broad-shouldered, sharp-featured, with the look of a battle-hardened warrior. Grace recognized him at once. Carter Brooks, Alexander's most loyal bodyguard, the man who had saved his boss on the fateful night 2 years ago. "Come with me," Carter said, brief, his voice low and urgent. "Hurry, before the cameras swing back this way." Grace didn't ask questions. She didn't have time to ask. She only ran after him as he led her through corridors she had never walked, down a narrow staircase hidden behind a wall hanging, into a small basement room that perhaps no one in the estate knew about except the people closest to Alexander. "Here," Carter said, shutting the door behind them. "You're safe here." Raymond doesn't know about this place. Why are you helping me? Grace asked, breathless after the run. Carter studied her for a long moment, his eyes sharp as a blade. Because I've been watching you for 2 weeks. I saw what you did. I saw my boss respond. He's still in there, and you're the only one who saw it. He turned away, his hand closing around the door handle. Miss Isabella is dealing with Raymond. She told me to keep you safe until she's finished. Grace wanted to ask more, but Carter stepped out and shut the door. She sank onto an old chair in the dim room, her heart still racing, and prayed Isabella had the strength to stand against the man who had shot her brother. Upstairs, Isabella Kensington stood facing Raymond in his office, her brown eyes blazing with a fire no one would have believed could exist in the young woman who had always been gentle and quiet. You will not fire her, Isabella said, her voice hard as steel. She is Alexander's only chance. Raymond scoffed. You have no authority here, Isabella. You're only the sister. I'm the one who makes decisions. Then I'll call Vincent Moretti, Isabella replied, and she watched Raymond's face change instantly. I'll tell him everything. About your plan to pull the tubes, about how you're treating Alexander, and about what I suspect really happened the night my brother was shot. The room fell into a tense silence. Vincent Moretti was a longtime ally of the Kensington family, a man with power equal to Alexander's when Alexander had still been awake. If he learned about Raymond's plot, everything would collapse. Raymond's jaw tightened, those ice-cold eyes fixed on his sister. Fine, he said through clenched teeth. 2 days. You and that crazy nurse have 2 days. But if there are no results, no one will be able to stop me anymore. The last night before the deadline fell on the 14th day. Grace sat in the basement room all day, waiting until darkness swallowed the Kensington estate and everyone drifted into sleep. Carter had drawn her a map of the corridors, marking the positions of the security cameras and the timing of their sweeps back and forth. 2 in the morning was the safest window, when the guard shift changed and there was a 15-minute gap when no one monitored the hallway leading to room 317. 15 minutes. That was all she had. Grace slipped out of the basement at 1:55, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She moved like a ghost through the dark halls, avoiding each camera corner according to Carter's map, holding her breath whenever she heard even the smallest sound. In her pocket was her phone containing the final recording, the one Isabella had sent through Carter just a few hours earlier. The door to room 317 opened without a sound. Grace slipped inside and closed it again, leaning her back against the wall for a moment to let her heartbeat settle. The room was the same as always, drowned in darkness, broken only by moonlight, slipping through a crack in the curtains, and the blinking blue glow of the machines. And Alexander was still there, motionless, silent, the way he had been for 730 days. Grace went to the bedside, pulled the chair closer, and took the familiar hand. The hand was still warm as always, and it gave a small squeeze when she touched it, as if Alexander knew she had come. This might be the last night, she whispered, her voice thick with tears. Tomorrow, Raymond will carry out his plan. Tomorrow, they'll remove your ventilator, and I don't know if I can stop it. Alexander's hand tightened, as if he understood every word. Grace closed her eyes and let the tears run freely down her cheeks. She had tried. She had done everything she could, but maybe it still wasn't enough. Maybe fate had already decided. Maybe she would fail again, just like the night she let the blonde-haired little girl slip out of her hands. No. Grace opened her eyes and wiped her tears with the back of her other hand. One more night. One more chance. She wouldn't give up until time truly ran out. She pulled out her phone and opened the recording Isabella had sent. This one was different. Not their mother's voice from years ago, but Isabella singing the song their mother used to sing to all 3 of them every night before sleep. Isabella had recorded it this afternoon, her voice trembling with emotion, but the melody was still the same as the way their mother had sung it. Grace pressed play and let the sound fill the room. Isabella's voice rose, clear and aching, singing the lullaby in English, mixed with a few lines of Italian their mother had carried from her homeland. The tune was gentle, soothing, but it carried the deep sorrow of someone singing to a person who might never truly hear again. Grace looked down at Alexander's face and saw what she had seen before. A tear slid from the corner of his closed eye, moving slowly down his temple. But this time it wasn't only 1. 2 tears. 3. The tears kept falling as if 2 years of suffering, loneliness, and helplessness were breaking open on this final night. Grace bent down, rested her forehead against the hand gripping hers, and cried with him. The 2 of them wept in silence, her tears falling onto his skin, his tears soaking into the white pillow. One last night. One last chance. Alexander. Grace lifted her head and looked straight at his face, even though she knew he couldn't look back. Her voice shook, but each word was clear, each one carrying the full weight of her heart. If you're still in there, if you can hear me, I need you to come back. Not for me. She shook her head, tears still falling. I don't matter, but Isabella needs you. Your sister has cried every day for 2 years. She still believes you'll return. She's still waiting. If you go, she'll lose the last person she has left in this family. Grace squeezed Alexander's hand tighter, as if trying to send her strength into him through that small point of contact. And there are other people too. People who are loyal to you. People who are waiting for you to come back and demand justice. People who need you to lead them. You can't leave like this. You can't let the traitor win. The recording ended. The room sank into absolute silence, with only the steady whisper of the ventilator and the pounding of Grace's heart in her ears. She stared at Alexander's face, at the tears still clinging to his skin, and she prayed to anyone who might be listening. Please let him come back, she whispered into the darkness. Please don't let me lose one more person. And in the darkness of room 317, with Alexander's warm hand in her own, Grace Sullivan waited for a miracle she didn't know would come. 3:17 in the morning. The clock on the wall blinked green numbers in the dark, marking the moment the whole world was about to change. Grace was still there, her hand clenched around Alexander's, her forehead resting against the edge of the bed, exhausted after 2 weeks of fighting and 1 night of crying herself empty. The recording had ended long ago. The room had sunk into a heavy silence, broken only by the steady whisper of the ventilator, like the beat of an artificial heart, and the soft sound of Grace's breathing dissolving into the darkness. Her eyes were closed, so tired she didn't even have the strength to cry anymore. Maybe she had failed. Maybe all her effort had meant nothing. Maybe tomorrow morning Raymond would win, and Alexander would be gone forever. Maybe she would lose one more person again. The way she had lost the blonde-haired little girl. The way she had lost her mother. The way she had lost her entire childhood. She was about to let go. She was about to surrender. And then it happened. Alexander's hand tightened. Not the gentle squeeze she had felt before. Not a squeeze meant to answer a question in the system they had built. A hard squeeze. So hard Grace's eyes flew open from the pain. A squeeze as if someone had poured the strength of 2 years of paralysis into one single movement. As if a soul were trying to smash through the prison of flesh and bone that had held it for 730 days. Grace lifted her head, her heart racing, eyes wide as she stared at Alexander's face. And she saw it. His eyes were opening, slowly, with effort. As if every millimeter of those lids lifting demanded something superhuman. But they were opening. For the first time in 2 years, Alexander Kensington's eyes were opening to the world. Grace stopped breathing. She sat there frozen, not daring to move, not daring to trust what she was seeing. Maybe she was dreaming. Maybe exhaustion had pushed her into hallucination. Maybe this was only the last reflex of a body about to go dark. But then those eyes looked straight at her. Not the blank stare of someone waking from a long coma. A conscious gaze. A gaze that recognized. The gaze of a man who had waited for this moment for 2 years and finally, was looking at the face he most wanted to see. His eyes were a stormy gray blue, deep as the ocean after a hurricane, and in the instant they locked onto Grace's, she felt as if he was looking straight through to her soul, seeing the orphan girl from Philadelphia, seeing the scars of her past, seeing the pain she had carried, seeing it all, and still not turning away. "Alexander," Grace whispered, her voice shaking so badly it almost didn't form sound. "You're awake. You can hear me." Alexander's lips moved, slowly, with difficulty, the muscles of his face twitching as if trying to remember how to command a body that had not obeyed him for 2 years. Grace leaned closer, close enough to feel the faint, fragile breath against her cheek. She held her own breath and waited, her heart pounding so hard in her chest it felt ready to burst. And then the sound slipped out, rough, weak, like the whisper of someone who had not spoken for 730 days, like an echo from a place so far away light could not touch it, but clear. Clear enough that Grace could swear it before any court in the world. One word, only one. Grace. Her name. He said her name. He knew her name. For 2 years in the dark, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything except listen. He had heard everything. He had heard her footsteps every night. He had heard her voice, the stories she told, the promises she swore. He had felt her hand holding his, had known who she was, had carved her name into his mind like a lighthouse guiding him home. And the first word he spoke when he came back to the world was not Isabella, not Raymond, not anyone else. It was Grace. Grace's tears broke loose. She cried like she had never cried in her life, as if every tear she had held back for all those years had finally found a way out. She bent down and pressed her forehead to Alexander's, letting her tears spill onto his face, mixing with the tears sliding from the corners of his newly opened eyes. "You heard me," she whispered through her sobs. "For 2 years, you heard me." Alexander didn't answer with words. He couldn't. His throat still didn't have the strength for more, but his hand squeezed hers again, and those storm-gray blue eyes never left her eyes for a single second. In the moonlight slipping through the crack in the curtains, in room 317, where a miracle no one believed in had happened, Grace Sullivan and Alexander Kensington looked at each other for the first time as 2 real human beings. No longer nurse and patient, no longer the one who spoke and the one who listened, but 2 souls who had found each other in the dark, who had held on to each other when the world walked away. And now, finally, were seeing each other in the light. 3:17 in the morning, the moment Alexander Kensington returned from the dead. The moment Grace Sullivan realized she hadn't only saved a life, she had found the thing she didn't know she had been searching for her entire life. And the moment the most powerful underworld empire in America was about to shake to its foundations. Grace hit the emergency call button immediately. She had no other choice. Alexander was awake. His eyes were open. He had spoken his first word. But he still needed medical care right away after 2 years in a coma. The alarm rang through the estate, shattering the silence of the late night. And within minutes, the entire mansion seemed to jolt awake from sleep. "Doctor." Whitfield was the first to burst into room 317, silver hair sticking up in disarray, coat thrown on in haste, eyes still heavy with sleep. But when he saw Alexander lying there with his eyes open, looking back at him with a gaze that was fully awake, the elderly doctor froze as if struck by lightning. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This can't happen. His brain, the tests. I checked. Doctor." Whitfield stumbled to the bedside like a man drunk, his hands shaking as he lifted a penlight and shone it into Alexander's eyes. The pupils reacted. The eyes tracked the light. Every neurological sign pointed to a brain functioning normally, the same brain he had declared dead for 2 years. "She was right," Grace said, and there was satisfaction in her voice she didn't try to hide. "I told you he was still conscious. You didn't believe me. No one believed me. But I was right." Dr. Whitfield didn't answer. He stood there, face gone pale, hands still trembling, and Grace could see the collapse in his eyes, the collapse of everything he had believed about medicine, about himself, about what he had told the Kensington family for 2 years. The door flew open again, and Raymond Kensington walked in. He was still wearing his perfectly tailored gray suit, as always, but his eyes were red from being dragged out of sleep, and his mouth carried the mocking smile he saved for anyone who dared disturb him. "What's going on here?" Raymond demanded, his voice thick with irritation. "I thought the nurse was fired. Why is she still here? And why is everyone—" His words died in his throat, because in that instant, Raymond saw his brother. Alexander Kensington's storm-gray blue eyes were open, fixed on him, and there was no haze of someone newly awake in that stare. Only coldness, recognition, judgment. Raymond's face went white as paper. All the color drained from him in a heartbeat, leaving him gray as a corpse. He stumbled back 1 step, then 2, as if he were staring at a ghost clawing its way up from hell. "No," Raymond whispered, his voice shaking. "No, this can't be. You can't wake up. You should." Alexander opened his mouth. His throat was still dry from 2 years of disuse, but he forced every last bit of strength into each word, pushing sound out no matter how much it hurt. "Brother," he choked out, his voice a broken, agonized rasp like stone grinding on stone. "Traitor." Raymond stood there, eyes wide, mouth hanging open, as if those 2 words had punched through his chest harder than 3 bullets ever could. He knows. Alexander knew everything. He had heard, understood, remembered, for 2 years in the dark. You're mistaken," Raymond stammered, trying to pull himself together. "You just woke up. You don't know what happened. I took care of you. I kept the empire running. A metallic click cut through Raymond's lie. Carter stepped out of the shadowed corner of the room where he had been standing silently the whole time, and in his hand was a gun aimed straight at Raymond's head. Boss, Carter said, his voice low and steady. I'm waiting for the order. Raymond spun around, his face twisting with fear and fury. You dare point a gun at me? Who the hell do you think you are? I'm the man who found my boss in a pool of blood that night. Carter cut in, his voice cold as ice. I'm the man who did chest compressions for 15 minutes while we waited for the ambulance. I'm the man who swore I would protect him with my life. And I'm the man who will blow your skull apart right here if my boss gives the word. The room sank into a tense silence. Raymond stood there with a gun aimed at his head. Doctor. Whitfield stood frozen beside the bed. Grace held Alexander's hand as if she feared someone would tear him away from her. And then the door opened again, and Isabella ran in. The young woman saw her brother lying there with his eyes open, and everything else disappeared. She ran to the bed, collapsed beside Alexander, and cried. She cried like a child who had lost the person she loved most and now had him back. She cried like someone who had carried hope for 2 years and finally watched it become real. Brother, Isabella sobbed, her arms wrapping around him as if afraid he would vanish. I knew you'd come back. I always knew. Alexander couldn't speak anymore. His throat was exhausted after those short, harsh words, but his hand lifted, slowly, with effort, and settled on his sister's hair, a familiar gesture from years ago, when he had still been the brother who protected her from every darkness. And in room 317 that night, amid Isabella's tears, the constant beeping of machines, and Carter's gun still aimed at the traitor, the most powerful underworld empire in America began to shake to its foundations. The days that followed became Alexander Kensington's new war. A war with no guns, no outside enemy, but a battle against the very body that had betrayed him for 2 years. Learning to speak was the first trial. His throat had not worked for 730 days, the muscles that controlled his voice wasting away as if they had never existed at all. Every word he tried to force out demanded a massive effort, as if he were trying to push a boulder up a mountain using nothing but the strength of his throat. In the beginning, he could only whisper a few syllables before exhaustion swallowed him, but he didn't quit. Alexander Kensington had never known what quitting was. Learning to walk was true hell. His leg muscles had nearly disappeared after 2 years of lying still. His bones weakened from disuse, his joints stiff as stone from being left untouched. The first time the physical therapists helped him sit up, Alexander nearly passed out from dizziness. The first time they set his feet on the ground, he couldn't stand for even a single second. But he tried, day after day, hour after hour, with pain tearing through every step, with sweat soaking his clothes as if he had just run a marathon, with falls and getting back up, until his body began to remember how to do what it had forgotten for 2 years. And Grace was beside him every day. She was no longer an official nurse. Raymond had fired her, and that decision still stood on paper. But Alexander had given his first order since waking. Grace Sullivan stays. Anyone who touched her would answer to him. No one dared disobey Alexander Kensington, even while he was still confined to a hospital bed. Every morning, Grace came into his room with a smile and a new story. She sat beside him through the brutal physical therapy sessions, held his hand when he clenched his teeth against the pain, wiped the sweat from his forehead when he collapsed into exhaustion. She read to him when his voice was too tired to speak. She told him about the world outside when he couldn't leave the room. She became his light, his guide, the reason he kept fighting every day. 3 months of grueling therapy allowed Alexander to finally speak in full sentences again, though his voice remained a low, gravelly shadow of what it once was. That afternoon, when the room held only the two of them, he asked Grace to sit beside his bed and said he needed to tell her something. Grace sat down, her hand instinctively wrapping around his the way it had on hundreds of nights before. She looked into those storm-gray blue eyes, watching her with a feeling she couldn't name, and she waited. I heard, Alexander began, his voice slow, each word deliberate, as if he were searching for the only words that could hold what couldn't be held. Everything. For 2 years. I heard everything. Grace held her breath. She had known this, had suspected it from the moment he spoke her name when he woke, but hearing him confirm it in his own voice still made her chest tighten. I heard Raymond, Alexander went on, his eyes darkening at his brother's name. Every time he came into my room, every sentence he said. He stood beside my bed and talked about how he would run the empire better than I ever did. He talked about the plan to pull the tubes. He laughed because he thought I couldn't hear. He paused and drew a deep breath to gather strength. Grace tightened her grip on his hand, letting him know she was here, that she was listening. I heard Dr. Whitfield, Alexander continued. He told Isabella I was dead, that there was no hope, that she should accept it and go on with her life. I wanted to scream that I was still here, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything. I was trapped inside my own body, a prison with no exit. His voice shook, and Grace saw his eyes redden even though no tears fell. I heard Isabella cry, he said, and his voice turned thick. Every week she came to visit. Every week she sat beside my bed and cried. She told me she missed me. She sang the song our mother used to sing, and I couldn't hold her. I couldn't tell her I was still here. I couldn't do anything except lie there and listen to her breaking apart day after day. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to contain what was rising inside him. Then he opened them and looked straight at Grace with a gaze so intense she felt pierced by it. "And then you came," he said, and his voice suddenly softened in a way Grace had never heard from him. "You walked into my room that first night, and everything changed. You talked to me, not about me as if I were a corpse, not in the pitying voice people use when they're looking at someone who is dying. You talked to me like I was alive, like I could hear, like I deserved to be treated like a human being." Alexander lifted the hand holding hers, slowly, with difficulty because the strength still hadn't fully returned, and placed it against his chest, directly over his heart. "Every night, you came," he said, his voice a whisper, almost a prayer. "Every night, you held my hand, told me about your life, about the world outside, about the small things no one else bothered to tell. You were the only one who believed I was still here when the whole world had walked away. You were the only thread holding me to this world." Tears began to run down Grace's face, and she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall freely, onto the hand resting over his chest, onto the heart beating beneath warm skin. "If it hadn't been for you," Alexander said, his voice catching, "I would have let go a long time ago. I would have let the darkness take me. But every night, your voice pulled me back. Every night, you gave me a reason to keep fighting. You saved me, Grace Sullivan, not with medicine, but by refusing to let me disappear." 2 months after waking, Alexander Kensington was strong enough to sit in a wheelchair and preside over his first meeting since the fateful night 2 years earlier. The largest meeting room in the estate was packed, filled with familiar faces from the underworld empire Alexander had built over the years. They came not because they were invited. They came because the rumor had spread through the criminal world like wildfire. The king had returned from the dead, and the traitor was about to pay. Vincent Moretti sat in the place of honor to Alexander's right, a 52-year-old man with salt and pepper hair and eyes sharp as a blade. He was the oldest ally of the Kensington family, a man who had fought beside Alexander's father decades earlier, and one of the few with enough power to challenge Raymond during those 2 years. Raymond stood at the back of the room, guarded by Carter and 2 other bodyguards. He had tried to run the night Alexander woke up, but no one in the Empire dared to help a traitor once the true boss had returned. Now he stood there in a rumpled suit, eyes hollow from sleeplessness, the familiar arrogance gone, replaced by fear he could no longer hide. Alexander didn't say much. He didn't need to. He only ordered Carter to play the recording Isabella had secretly obtained in the months before he woke. Raymond's phone calls with the family's rivals, plans to divide the empire after Alexander died, confessions about the night of September 15th, 2022. The room fell into silence when the recording ended. No one looked at Raymond. No one needed to. The evidence was too clear to require any further explanation. Vincent Moretti was the first to speak. He stood, looking directly at Alexander with an expression stern but filled with deep respect. "I've suspected it for a long time," Vincent said, his low voice carrying through the room. "But without proof, we couldn't act. Now the proof is here. I, Vincent Moretti, declare my support for Alexander Kensington as the only leader of this empire. Anyone still standing with Raymond Kensington is my enemy." One by one, the others in the room rose and made the same declaration. No one chose Raymond, not a single one. The man who thought he had won now stood there alone like he had never been alone in his life, surrounded by the people he used to command, betrayed by his own betrayal. Alexander delivered his judgment in a calm voice that was chilling. "Raymond Kensington is exiled from the family. Assets confiscated. Dr. Whitfield did not escape justice either. For his betrayal of medical ethics and conspiracy with Raymond, he was stripped of his medical license and handed over to the authorities to face the consequences of his actions. Power stripped. He will leave the country within 24 hours and never set foot here again. If anyone in the Empire sees him on American soil after that deadline, they are free to handle it however they want. It was mercy Raymond did not deserve, and everyone in the room knew it. Alexander could have ordered his brother killed on the spot and no one would have dared to object. But he didn't. Not because he forgave him, because he had changed. Raymond was escorted out without a word. He looked back at his brother one last time, but Alexander didn't return that look. To him, Raymond had died on the night 3 bullets tore through his body. The man being led away was only the ghost of someone who had once been his brother. After the meeting, when the room was empty and only Isabella and Grace remained, Alexander sat in his wheelchair by the window, looking out at the garden where his mother had planted flowers years before. Isabella came to sit beside him, resting her head on his shoulder the way she had as a child. "You've changed," she said softly. "Before, you would have killed Raymond without blinking." Alexander was silent for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice carried a depth of reflection Grace had never heard from him before. "Before, I had been dead on the inside for a long time. Since the day our mother died, I froze every feeling because I thought it was the only way to survive. I became a machine without a heart because I thought it was the only way to be strong." He turned his wheelchair and looked at Grace standing near the door with a tenderness he reserved only for her. "But 2 years in the dark taught me one thing. Living without feeling isn't living. Existing with no one beside you is no different from death. I stayed frozen for 24 years after my mother died. Only now am I truly alive." Isabella smiled through tears, and Grace, the girl who had pulled him out of the darkness, felt her heart soften and melt as she met the storm, gray-blue eyes that looked at her as if she were the whole world. 3 months after Alexander woke up, he could walk with a cane and no longer needed the wheelchair. His recovery moved faster than any doctor had predicted, as if his body were trying to make up for the 2 years it had lost. The Kensington estate slowly returned to its normal rhythm, the empire running smoothly under Alexander's leadership, everything seeming to fall back into place. That was when Grace decided she had to leave. She stood outside the door of Alexander's office on a spring afternoon, holding a small suitcase identical to the one she had carried into the estate 4 months earlier. Her heart hurt as if someone were squeezing it shut, but she knew this was the right thing to do. She was a nurse. He had been her patient. The patient was healed. The job was done. She had no reason to stay anymore. Alexander was sitting by the window when Grace entered, his tall frame cut in silhouette against the red fire of the evening sky. He turned at the sound of the door, and his storm-gray blue eyes went straight to the suitcase in her hand. His gaze darkened in an instant. "Where are you going?" Alexander asked, his voice calm, but Grace heard the tension beneath every word. "Back to Philadelphia," Grace answered, forcing her voice not to shake. "You've recovered. You don't need a nurse anymore. I have no reason to stay here. I should go back to my life." Alexander stood and walked toward her, his steps still slightly uneven but steady. He stopped less than a step away, close enough that Grace could catch the masculine scent of the cologne he still wore, close enough that she had to tilt her face up to meet his eyes. "You're right," Alexander said, his voice dropping lower. "I don't need a nurse anymore." Grace's chest tightened. She knew this. She had prepared for it, but hearing him say it still hurt more than she expected. She nodded, trying to smile even as her lips trembled. "Then I'll go. Thank you for everything. I hope you'll—" "But I need you," Alexander cut in, and each word fell into the space between them like a jewel. "Not as a nurse. As you, Grace Sullivan. The woman who saved me, the woman who talked to me every night when the whole world walked away. The first woman who made me want to live, want to feel, want to love, after 24 years of being frozen." Grace stood there, and her suitcase slipped from her hand without her noticing. She stared into Alexander's eyes, searching for any sign that he was joking, exaggerating, confusing gratitude with something else. But she found nothing but absolute sincerity. "I'm not worthy," Grace whispered, her voice catching. "I'm just an orphan girl from Philadelphia. I grew up in an orphanage. I lived on the streets. I don't have a family. I don't have a past to be proud of. I have nothing but scars. And you're Alexander Kensington. You think I care about any of that?" Alexander asked, and for the first time Grace saw a real smile on his mouth. The smile Isabella said only appeared when he was truly happy. "You think money or power means anything to me after 2 years in the dark. I had all of that and I was still alone. I was the king of an underworld empire and I was still dying on the inside. Until you came." He lifted his hand, slow and gentle, and rested it against Grace's cheek. The warmth of his palm against her skin felt like a promise. "Tonight, stay with me," Alexander said. "Not as a nurse, just as you. Tell me about your life, about the scars you carry, about everything you've kept hidden, and I'll tell you about me, about who I really am, not the king of darkness everyone fears. They sat on the balcony outside Alexander's room that night, under a sky full of stars. Grace had never seen so clearly in Philadelphia. She told him everything, about the addicted mother who abandoned her, about the orphanage and the years of hell inside it, about the manager and the nights she wished she could disappear, about the streets of Philadelphia and how she learned to survive, about becoming a nurse and the blonde-haired little girl who died in her hands. For the first time in her life, Grace cried in front of another person. She cried for the 5-year-old child abandoned by her mother. She cried for the 14-year-old girl who had her innocence stolen. She cried for the 27-year-old woman still carrying scars no one could see. And Alexander held her. He didn't speak. He only held her, letting her cry into his shoulder, letting the tears she had held back for 22 years finally find their way out. When Grace lifted her head, eyes red, cheeks wet, she saw Alexander watching her with a look she had never seen anyone give her before. Not pity, not disgust, but admiration, love, reverence for a fighter who had been through hell and still stood tall. "You and I are the same," Alexander whispered. "Both abandoned by the world, both rebuilt from ashes, both carrying scars other people can't see. Maybe that's why you were the only one who could see me when I was trapped in the dark." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted to. But Grace didn't pull away. She closed her eyes and accepted their first kiss under the star-filled sky. His lips were warm and gentle, the kiss soft the way he had held her hand through all those nights beside the bed. When they parted, Alexander rested his forehead against hers, his breath blending with hers in the intimate space between them. "You gave me a reason to live," he whispered. "Now give me the chance to live for you." 1 year after that first kiss on the balcony, the Kensington estate glowed in the summer sunlight the way it hadn't glowed in decades. The garden Alexander's mother had once planted was now bursting with thousands of white roses, ivory ribbons fluttering in the soft breeze, and rows of oak chairs lined up neatly to welcome the guests. Today was the wedding day of Alexander Kensington and Grace Sullivan. Alexander stood at the end of the aisle draped in white, his tall frame in a perfectly tailored black suit, with no trace left of the man who had once lain motionless for 2 years. He had fully recovered, his body strong again, just as it had been before. 3 bullets tore through his chest and his head. But the greatest change wasn't physical. It was in the way his eyes now knew how to smile, in the way the corner of his mouth could curve into a real grin, in the way his heart had thawed after 25 years of being locked in ice. And Grace was no longer the small nurse from Philadelphia with the old suitcase and the scarred past. She now led the largest charitable program the Kensington family had ever funded, a foundation supporting orphaned children and survivors of domestic violence that Alexander had created in her name. Every year, hundreds of children were rescued from hellish orphanages like the one Grace had survived, given an education, given love, given the chance Grace had once wished for as a little girl. She had turned her pain into strength to save others, and that made Alexander love her more every day. When the wedding music rose and Grace appeared at the head of the aisle in a pure white gown, Alexander felt his heart stop for a beat. She was breathtaking, but not because of fabric or makeup. It was the beauty of a woman who had walked through hell and still kept a heart that could love, could hope, could refuse to give up. Isabella walked beside Grace, taking the place of the father the bride didn't have. The young woman cried and smiled at once, happy that her brother had finally found the one who deserved him. Carter stood behind Alexander as best man, his hardened face breaking into a real smile for the first time in years. When Grace reached Alexander and they turned to face each other, the world around them seemed to disappear. There was only them, 2 souls who had found each other in the dark, now standing beneath the sun and vowing to love each other for the rest of their lives. Alexander took Grace's hands and spoke his vows, his voice carrying through the quiet garden. 2 years ago, I was lying in the dark, and I thought I would die there. No one could hear me. No one believed I still existed. I was ready to let go. And then you came. He tightened his grip on her hands, his eyes shining with tears he didn't let fall. Your voice was the only thread that kept me tied to this world. Every night you talked to me, you gave me a reason to keep fighting. You didn't know I could hear, but you still spoke. You didn't know I was still there, but you still believed. You saved me, Grace Sullivan, not with medicine, but by refusing to give up when the whole world had walked away. Today, I swear I will spend the rest of my life becoming worthy of the love you gave me. Grace cried as she spoke her vows, her voice trembling but every word clear. I came to this estate to run from my past. I never imagined I would find my future. You taught me that scars don't define a person. The way we live with those scars defines who we are. I love you, Alexander Kensington. Not because of who you are in the world, but because you are the only one who truly saw me and still didn't leave. They shared their first kiss as husband and wife beneath the sun and the applause of the people who loved them. And in that moment, Grace knew she had found what she had searched for her whole life. A family, a place to belong, a love that would never abandon her. The story of Alexander Kensington and Grace Sullivan is proof of the power of faith and compassion. Sometimes in life, we meet people the whole world has abandoned, people everyone says are beyond hope. But remember this, sometimes the strongest medicine isn't found in any pharmacy. Sometimes miracles don't come from medicine or science. Sometimes what pulls a person out of the dark is simply the hand of someone who refuses to let go, the voice of someone who refuses to stay silent, the heart of someone who believes that hopeless has never meant finished. Grace Sullivan didn't save Alexander Kensington with drugs or techniques. She saved him by refusing to let him disappear. And sometimes, that is all a person needs. Someone who believes they are still here. This story reminds us never to underestimate the power of care, of patience, of not giving up on the people around us. Someone in your life may be needing a voice, a hand, a heart that believes in them when they can't believe in themselves anymore. Be that person for them. Thank you for watching today's story. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, hit like, and share this video with the people you love. We want to hear how you feel. What did this story mean to you? Did it remind you of someone in your life? Have you ever been a grace for someone? Or have you ever had someone refuse to abandon you when you needed it most? Share with us in the comments below. We truly look forward to reading the stories from deep in your hearts. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Always remember you deserve to be loved, and never give up on the people you love. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.